the SOEs, but in countries like Lebanon, the private sector is more prominent. The SOEs also represent a significant part of the total employment. In many countries, public sector has served as an employer of last resort. Public employment counts for 32% of the total employment. I believe it's 27% the global average. In countries like Libya, Algeria, Kuwait, the figure is above 60%. In terms of SOE performance, again, the results are very varied. In Algeria, probably the worst example in this case, the net financial flows from government to SOEs have at times amounted to almost a quarter of GDP. But then again, in a number of Gulf countries, there are very, perhaps surprisingly successful SOEs. I mentioned privatization. Here's some data. As you can see that the privatization never really got going on in the region, except for Egypt and Jordan. The main reasons for this are usually considered to be 1, lack of political will, 2, overstaffing, 3, low pace of job creation in the private sector, and 4, pressure by interest groups. The region's privatization receipts in the 1990s reached $8.2 billion, which is a figure that is comparable to privatization proceeds in the sub-Saharan Africa, and much smaller than in other emerging economies. Corporate governance is a rather new concept in the Middle East. In fact, there was no Arabic word for corporate governance till about 8 years ago. The private sector are currently starting to embrace good corporate governance, and this has been extended to the sphere of SOEs as well. The idea is that corporate efficiency can be attained through better corporate governance, and these are some of the assumptions that are being held. And it is for these reasons HAUKAMA, jointly with the OECD, has launched a task force on SOE governance. The task force comprises representatives of holding companies, state audit institutions, ministries, regulatory authorities, and individual SOEs. There are some 18 countries participating in this work at the moment. The idea behind the task force is basically 2 objectives: to take stock of the existing governance frameworks in the SOEs. It's a data collection exercise, and this is what we're doing at the moment. I'll share with you some preliminary findings, but once we have the final findings, a policy brief will be issued with detailed and concrete recommendations. And although there is the oil money and the natural gas money, which obviously makes comparisons very difficult, but what seems to be clear is that these efficient SOEs have clear mandates, clear incentive structures, and that these incentives and mandates come from strictly limited and a very coherent set of principles. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Altonen. We will now listen to Dr. Muhammad Rizal Salim. Thank you.
I'm asked to talk about the privatization, GLCs, the role of GLCs in Malaysia, the challenges relating to privatization. A whole list of set of corporatization policies takes place in which state-owned enterprises are converted into companies, but in which the government holds all of the shares. And later on, this becomes a precursor for the privatization policy. And in the privatization policy, companies which were previously corporatized were then privatized, shares offered, and in a number of companies, they were listed in the stock exchange. And in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, some of these companies falls into great financial difficulties. We have companies which were previously privatized were then bailed out by the government. Examples including our national carrier, Malaysian Airlines System, and then we have companies such as Proton, our national car maker, which suffers great financial losses. And then after that, in year 2004, there was a study conducted in which it was found that government-listed companies, government-linked companies are lagging behind in all financial indicators except for size. By the PGC, Putrajaya Committee, and this is the policy thrust of it. They look at three underlying principles for GLCs. And these three underlying principles are firstly national GLCs as the founder of National Development Foundation. And then they look at the performance focus, that GLCs must create economic and shareholder value. And thirdly, governance and again shareholder value. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is some of the difficulties in achieving these three underlying principles. The biggest difficulty is the compromise that has to be obtained in a company between one, achieving national policy, secondly, as a legal entity, as a company, the ultimate motivation is for the interest of the shareholders. But because GLCs are ultimately have social objections, therefore, the stakeholder concerns have to be taken into account as well. In legal terms, GLCs are like any other company. In a company, there's no difference between a private entity, a public company, or a public listed company. They're all ruled by the same rules. And the rule is that companies must be managed to enhance shareholder value. In a GLC, that becomes a problem because shareholder value has to be tempered by the interests of the stakeholders. And the interests of the stakeholders may vary. This may be the interests of the public, the interests of the community, the interests of whatever other groups there behind the company. And the law says that when directors must act in the best interest of the company, and the best interest of the company means the best interest of the shareholders. When directors act the best interest of people who are other than the company, such as the stakeholders, they must ensure that it is also for the best interest of the company. If they don't, then it's a breach of directors' duties. We have a conflict between shareholder value on one hand and stakeholder value on the other hand. At the same time, in Policy Trust 3, they expect the owners, the GLICs, government-linked investment companies, to be more proactive in management. How this is done is that there's a tendency now for GLICs to insist that they are represented on the board of directors. And this has come at the expense of the management representation of the board. Yeah? And shareholders as monitors now has taken a different twist in Malaysia in terms of they now are represented on the board and can directly influence the board. And the board ultimately, instead of performing their duty in the best interest of the company, are now sometimes compelled to act in the interest of these nominating shareholders, the GLICs. That becomes a corporate governance issue. Thank you very much.
Professor Salim, thank you very much for that presentation. And may I now move on to Mr. Dag Detter, please. Mr. Detter, please.
Dear Ministers, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here today. The main purpose of my speech will be to give you a couple of practical examples. I assume I represent the practical side of restructuring, transforming, and making SOEs profitable. Europe has had a very interesting development since the 1990s when privatizations was all the rage. It started off as almost as a consequence of what then was called the Washington Consensus, that the only good SOE was a dead SOE or a privatized one. And this ended up that almost all of Europe's SOEs was privatized, or at least that's what we thought. The experiment was a part of deregulation, but where UK was one of the thought leaders, but there were very many governments in continental Europe that did quite well in this game. However, today, I think the result is that we have about 3 trillion euros worth of SOEs left in Europe. And therefore, a lot of the continental governments in Europe did not quite agree with this, because they have kept a lot of these SOEs for a reason. So it's about 20% of GDP, not in contribution terms, but in value terms, that are actually state-owned commercial assets today in Europe. And the first country to do anything about this was Sweden in 1998, who decided to, basically with the motto that we want to show the private sector that we can be as profitable as the private sector. And I had the honor or the dishonor to do this job, recruited from, I was then working as a banker in Asia and London. And this whole experience resulted in the state-owned enterprises outperforming the Swedish stock market, at least, in the middle of the financial crisis that time around. Today, Europe still has a lot of SOEs, and I've been asked also to mention something about China, where I've worked quite a lot, apart from some few jobs in the Middle East. But when China started on this journey, SOEs was almost 100% of GDP. It is now somewhere around 50, and has institutionalized their SOE governance in 2 holding companies, mainly, SASAC for the industrial companies, and Huijin for all the financial institutions. And both have been quite successful in improving corporate governance, profit, etc. And although dividends are still wanting, at least in terms of the industrial companies. A portfolio of 5 billion euros, which is about 20-25% of GDP, and all of it unleveraged, which you can understand, who are all of you economists or financial people, is an opportunity to run them more commercially. And they had no profits, no dividends. And the aim for this government is to make them more efficient and to make them produce both a profit and a dividend, which would then be able to contribute about 20%, to reduce the budget deficit with 20%, which is no small feat. And the government believes that this could be done within 12 to 18 months. And it would also have an impact on the government debt, which would be significant and very helpful. And this is something that is now widely talked about in Europe, and could be the Lithuanian model. So instead of the Washington Consensus, Europeans are hoping for the Vilnius Consensus, which could perhaps help with the budget deficit and the fiscal problems that we have in Europe. And this often means that you move from a governance model, which is prevailing in mostly around the world, which is the decentralized model that each ministry owns their own asset, which is very close to central planning, and it makes the conflict of interest between politics and commerce more acute, allowing for a separation, which is one of the reasons for creating all these holding companies and portfolios that YRK was talking about, is really to get away from this conflict of interest and make the wheel more even and allow it to spin faster and more efficiently. And within the OECD, there is a quite clear consensus for this, and more countries are moving towards this centralized model. Of course, there is a lot of debate whether it should be a holding company or a ministry, etc., and different countries are choosing different models. And of course, if you are running commercial companies, I would probably argue for having a commercial vehicle for that, but that is a big debate, so we're not going to get into that one. I just want to sow some seeds into the audience for further thought. If you have these three fundamental things set up so that the commercial wheel could start spinning, transparency, clear objective, and the political insulation, you will be very well prepared to do the restructuring of these assets. And in my experience, having done this in a couple of continents, I must say this works much faster and much quicker than you could anticipate if you have tried it in a different way before. And the results actually comes almost like a miracle. With that, I'd like to finish and thank you for your time, and I wish you good luck here.
He talked about the monitoring, the involving, the very important point that he made is how can the government monitor the functioning of these state-owned enterprises without actually getting involved in the day-to-day management. That's a big challenge, how to draw this thin line between monitoring and interference. And I think probably he hit the nail right on there when he said that's the greatest challenge that is being discussed or that's being debated about. He also talked about some of the statutory corporations which have been created by a law or by a statute, and some of them are department owned in some countries and others are like normal companies. So all these differences, all these changes in the region, and how a uniform code or uniform governing principle, a corporate governance guideline is being introduced in the region. That's what Mr. Altonen was talking about. Dr. Salim, unfortunately his slides did not work, but he did make an excellent presentation. He talked about the privatization experience, especially in the Malaysia. Earlier the foreign companies were nationalized, and then the state-owned enterprises were created for various objectives. He talked about all the shares being held by the government, and then talked about later privatization, especially after the 1997, the currency crisis and the financial crisis. They started moving towards corporatization, and talked about the difficult experience of Malaysian airline system and Proton after the privatization, and then the total relook they had in 2004, the professional study conducted about the SOEs and the results that came out of the study. And he did talk about the Putrajaya committee that talked about various objectives. The points were made by others also. There's always this conflict between what we call the national objective or the objectives of the societies and the objectives of the shareholders. When shareholders or the companies need to work on the commercial principle, but when you superimpose the national ideology or national principles or the state principle, there have been some conflict of interest in that. He also talking about these conflicts between various interests and the need for value creation, the the various law they are trying to bring in, and the interest of the company and the interest of the stakeholders and the shareholders, and how conflict arises between these two separate group of persons. Generally, the Malaysian experience was brought out very clearly by Dr. Salim, and now we moved on to Mr. Detter, who talked about the Swedish experience and also about the European experience. He was basically talking about Europe, where wholesale privatization took place as a matter of political policy in the 90s. The deregulation, the UK led it. The UK, of course, started much earlier, and the total mass sale of the public enterprises. But in spite of that, even today,